Hi, it's Nick Burke here again. Last week I ran an investor briefing on investing in regional towns and compared a few options for those spending this time of year considering where to invest in 2013. In that presentation I briefly mentioned the National Rental Affordability Scheme, and I've received a large number of emails since then asking for more information on this scheme, so I thought I'd put together a presentation on NRAS, and in particular what to look out for if you are considering this as an investment alternative. So let's have a look at the pros and the cons of investing in the National Rental Affordability Scheme. But firstly, let's have a look at the background of it. NRAS has been around for a while now, since 2008 when it was brought in by this guy. And when it was first introduced, it was a bit of a mess. The government forgot to consult with the banking industry about how they would go about lending funds to NRAS investors. And the banks didn't really like it because of the way it was structured. So it's taken a while to gather momentum, but now it's endured for more than 4 years, and it must be said it is now becoming quite a mainstream option. The difficulties have for the most part been overcome, and it's becoming a very viable and more commonly accepted property investment choice, which is why it's quite timely to be running this investor briefing on NRAS. Basically, if you're not familiar with it, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, or NRAS for short, is the federal government's response to rising rents and a lack of affordable rental property in many areas. The reason that the government brought this in was because the way things were going, average Australians who earned average wages were beginning to have trouble living in regular rental properties due to constantly escalating and increasingly unaffordable rents in many locations. In order to keep our communities vibrant and healthy, we need to house working Australians on modest wages within our communities, rather than forcing them to live a long way out of town or in dreadfully run-down properties closer in. And overseas, there are some terrible examples of what we're trying to avoid. It's particularly relevant for essential services workers, first responders, government employees, people like teachers, nurses, emergency services workers, as well as apprentices, trainees, young working people, hospitality workers, carers, and so on. These are really some of the most valuable people in our society, but they're not that highly paid. So an incentive is offered to investors to provide approved new properties in areas where the government has assessed there's a need at discounted rents. Rents are typically discounted 20 to 25%, and in return for this discount, the investor gets a whole bunch of cash from the government. It's really quite a lot. It's currently $9,981 every year for 10 years, and it's indexed to go up with inflation every year, so it'll end up averaging over 10 years more than $10,000 a year, or over $100,000 in total. So let's have a look at the pros and cons of this program. Well, the main advantage of NRAS is, of course, that the cash flows are much better. Typically, a new property is, say, around $450,000, which might typically rent for, say, $450 a week. So you drop your rent in this example by either 20 or 25%, and let's be conservative and use the 25% figure, which is $113 a week. And in return, you get $9,981 this year indexed from the government. So that's $193 per week. So straight away you appear to be about $80 per week better off. You drop 113, you pick up 193. It's actually a bit more complex than this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there are some slightly higher expenses on NRAS properties, but definitely not $80 a week. And secondly, rent is assessable income for tax purposes. NRAS payments are not. So you're giving up $113 a week of taxable income, and you're picking up $193 a week of tax-free income every week. So for investors paying tax at 40 cents in the dollar, which is where most investors are, getting an extra $80 tax-free is actually like getting an extra $133 in before tax extra rent. So who wouldn't want an effective extra $133 per week on a mainstream property in rental income? For most investors who are paying reasonable rates of tax, this can be a substantial difference and can turn a typically negative cash flow property into a neutral or even a positive cash flow property. These days, since the global financial crisis, mainstream property markets are a lot flatter than they used to be. The overall trend is and will continue to generally be upwards, but at nothing like the sort of double-digit growth rates that we experienced for many years leading up to 2007, at least not for the foreseeable future. So cash flow becomes a lot more important. For the most part, capital growth will still be worthwhile, but it's not worth losing thousands and thousands every year on, because unlike the good old days, you might not make that back in capital gains every year. And for cash flow, the most common choices are to go to the regional or small town areas where higher cash flows are available, or to find ways of increasing the yields in the mainstream property markets. And NRAS is one of the best ways of doing that. So the increased cash flow is the main benefit, but also you'd say as an additional benefit, there should always be plenty of tenants, because with your rent being 20 or 25% below the market, you're unlikely to ever have a shortage of tenants. So let's have a look at the cons, or the downsides. There are three. The first one is that they can be harder to finance. But this has been more true in the past than it is now. Previously, there were restrictions on your ability to sell the property in the open market, and the banks didn't like this because in the event of them having to repossess the property, if the investor were to default, they could not sell it easily straight away. Also, the lease was, and in some cases still is, registered on the title, which can become cumbersome to finance for resale or to do anything of a legal nature with the property. So it can be tricky to finance, but if you go to a finance broker who, perhaps unlike this guy who's scratching his head trying to work out how to finance them, has got plenty of experience in getting NRAS loans approved, then this issue can be easily overcome. So the next downside is that the expenses are a little higher, and I mentioned this earlier. So typically, the property manager, who is usually a charity or a consortium that are approved to manage NRAS properties, are responsible for keeping the property NRAS compliant. As such, they charge a higher management fee than a property manager managing a regular property. So the fees must be factored in to determine if the NRAS benefit payments that you receive are worth the extra fees, and it must be said that usually they are. So the third thing is the reputation of NRAS, and there has been a lot of misinformation written about NRAS, and generally the quality of the information available on the internet is poor, and some that I've read is just plain wrong. One of the common misconceptions is that it's a social housing program likely to attract poor quality tenants like unemployed people, dole bludgers, people on welfare, etc. Well, it's a mistake to think of NRAS in the same way. Firstly, it's for employed people only. No job, no NRAS property. It's for average Australians who don't earn a fortune. If they misbehave in the property, don't pay the rent, they're out, same as in any other property. In fact, with a target market of people like teachers, carers, police and the like, you've got to think that you've got a good chance of getting just as good or perhaps even a better class of tenant than in a regular property. Remember, there should always be plenty of tenants applying because the rent is discounted. And like any property managers, your NRAS manager will select the best applicant from amongst those who qualify from what will probably be a large number of applicants. For the most part, any poor reputation that NRAS tenants have is misguided. So there are three downsides of NRAS, but as I've explained, they're not so much downsides as more misconceptions. So what should you look for if you're considering investing in an NRAS property? This is where there are five things to look for. Firstly, you want to look for an affordable entry price. The thing about NRAS is it's a fixed amount. So this year it's $9,981. It's not a percentage. So it's the same whether you buy a $300,000 property or a $500,000 property. Or more correctly, it's the same whether the rent is $300 per week or $500 per week. And the 20 or the 25% discount you have to give away is obviously smaller on the cheaper, lower rent property. In order to get $100,000 tax-free over 10 years, I'd much rather give away $75 a week in rent than $125 a week in rent. So you need to look at the cash flows, and what you often find is that the cash flows are better on the cheaper NRAS properties as opposed to the more expensive ones. Not that cash flow is everything. You need to remain focused on the fact that NRAS is just a cool tool to keep the holding cost to zero while you hold a property long term and benefit from its capital growth. But it's just a factor to consider. The second thing to consider is that the properties are not overpriced. I've actually had a property developer come to me and ask, how much more do you think we can get for these properties because they're NRAS? Cheeky buggers. NRAS is supposed to provide incentives and benefits to working tenants and to clever landlords, not to property developers. Obviously, I gave that developer an earful and sent him packing. And I've seen numerous other NRAS projects that are overpriced. See, what happens is developers need to pay for their NRAS licenses, their ability to offer the NRAS program on their properties, and in some cases they appear to have been trying to pass these costs on. Obviously, these are the ones to avoid. So the third thing to look for is that it's just, let's call it a normal property. It's good not to get too carried away with NRAS. Remember why you're investing: for long-term capital growth. NRAS is just a way of holding a mainstream property in a mainstream location for 10 years or more, with all of the holding costs covered by the tenant and the taxman. Eventually, after 10 years or more, the NRAS benefits will cease and you'll be left with a property which you'll rent out, you'll sell it, you'll keep it, whatever. So you just want it to be a normal property. Don't buy into something that is particularly unusual if you can help it just to be part of NRAS. For example, a 2-bedroom house in a suburban housing estate where the most common demand is for 3- and 4-bedroom houses. It won't be a disaster if you do, but you just want to maximize your chances of being able to do whatever you want with a property after 10 years, to rent it or to sell it. So just a normal house or a normal apartment. So the fourth thing that you want to look out for is the ability to opt out of the NRAS program. You need to be able to sell your NRAS property if you want to, before the 10 years is up. And previously this was a problem, as the government stated you need to sell it to another NRAS investor, which obviously is a restriction on your market, and is one of the reasons the banks didn't like it. If you're going to invest in NRAS, make sure you can opt out with a short notice period, say about 90 days, and sell your property on the open market if you need to. And the fifth thing is what's called a non-entity joint venture. There are two ways your property manager can strike the agreements with you. One is a head lease model, which is the alternative to this, where they take a head lease over the property, which is often registered on the title and can provide all sorts of problems for the investor, particularly in relation to financing. And I'd avoid this model and ensure your agreements are what's called a non-entity joint venture. This simply gives them the property for management and gives you the discounted rent and the government incentives. It's a lot simpler as far as the lenders are concerned. So, in conclusion, NRAS is coming into its own. It's had a troubled history, but now is a good time to be considering it. If you want to own a property in a mainstream area without it costing you anything, then I'd strongly recommend that you do consider NRAS. Just be aware of the pros and cons and the 5 things to look out for. As I said at the beginning, I prepared this presentation just for information purposes only, not to try and sell you anything. There's nothing for sale as such, but of course we're always working with investors who are looking for various things, including NRAS. So if you're particularly keen on seeing what NRAS opportunities are out there, you are welcome to make contact with us. If you like, just reply to this email or send an email to that email address on your screen. Thank you. Stay safe. I hope you found this interesting and useful. Stay safe these summer holidays and enjoy the summer break. Bye for now.